Good evening. Welcome to the Dusty Feet. It's 9:15. Well, actually it's 19:05, but it's 9:15 September 15th, 2022. So tonight we're going to continue our homework series with Matthew, our part 16, an open-minded faith. This will be an interesting one. We're going to, like we do, tend to stretch things a little bit. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit so we can kind of get a context for things that we want to talk about, which should be fun. But don't forget, in the description below are links to all the audio, video, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. Want to make sure any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So please be sure to click to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and go look at TheDustyFeet.com. And as always in the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more homework series, Branches on the Vine, on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so you'll notice something interesting in the title right there. We have an outside the class. So one of the things that we're intending on doing here is moving our homework series to a post-it night. In other words, instead of going live like it's on Thursday nights, we're going to do post them. Okay, so there'll be a small shift in how we do things because since they're posted and they're not live, again, still in the links will be in the description for the video that we'll be talking about. But the expectation is you'll start with the first thing you want to do, hit pause, go back, watch the video, and then come and then listen to the talk. So it'll be shorter because we won't be playing the clips. We'll condense them a little bit, have some fun with that. So that's our goal here. We're not there yet, but that's our goal. So that's going to become outside the class. That's what we're going to call it. But tonight we're going to rock and roll with our same stuff, which is play a clip from Mackie, and then we'll talk about it and we'll stretch ourselves a little bit. So, as always, let's enjoy us some Tim Mackie.
Good morning. How you guys doing? Good to have you guys here. Welcome. If you're a visitor, my name's Tim. I'm one of the pastors here too. And here we go. Let's dive into these stories about Jesus. They hold many things for us today. As we go through the Gospel according to Matthew, it's the first and one of the largest accounts of the life of Jesus that's in the New Testament. And today's significant because we are at a turning point as we've been going through. We started last fall, and we're going to be going for a while. But we're at a turning point because if you've noticed, if you've been following with us for the last 9 Sundays, we have just been in stories about Jesus, one week after another. And there are stories that actually, if you've been paying attention, they all have a similar pattern. All of the stories in the last 9 Sundays. It's been of somebody coming to Jesus, and they have some crisis. They have something wrong, either them or someone that they care about. And they come to Jesus, and then Jesus, he either does or says something awesome, and usually both. And then what happens is they walk away from that encounter just totally transformed. There you go. That's the basic plot line of almost every story that we've been doing in the last 9 Sundays. And Matthew, as we're going to see, he's intentionally collected these 9 stories all here together in these chapters. And we're coming to the conclusion of that body of stories. And then next week, we're going to be off into new territory. A new kind of plot line begins in the Gospel according to Matthew. And each of these Sundays, mostly these have been stories about people getting healed by Jesus physically, although sometimes it's just some kind of spiritual transformation that they undergo. And every one of these has given us some new angle on who Jesus is, some new facet of his personality or of his identity. And it's like a mosaic, or think of like a stained glass window. Every story is contributing a piece that gives a new color, right? A new hue of who Jesus is and makes up this robust portrait. And so these stories right here, we have two more stories today, and they're short, aren't they? Right? There's a story of two blind men getting healed by Jesus, and then a story about this man who can't talk, and he's oppressed by spiritual evil, and then he's healed by Jesus. And then we have all these responses. And actually, I think it's these responses. There's two stories, but there's three responses to Jesus. Did you see it? As we read through the story, there's three very different kinds of responses to Jesus, and they all illuminate something about who Jesus is, and that's what we're going to focus on today. There's three responses. There's the blind men, there's the crowds. Did you notice the crowd's response? And then we have the response of the religious leaders, the Pharisees. Three very different responses to Jesus and his words and his activity. So I just want to take a brief minute to look at each of the three, and then that'll open up a whole bunch of stuff for us to track down, and that'll be fun, I think. It'll be fun for me, for sure. And for that guy, he's having fun right now. And some of you will be doing that later this afternoon. When it's 80 degrees, really? Come here at 5 p.m. and see how pleasant that is in the building. Okay, three responses. The blind men, the crowds, and the Pharisees. First of all, look at these two blind men. Look at verse 27. What's their response to Jesus? What do they call Jesus? When they see Jesus, they don't see Jesus coming. When they know that he's around and in their presence, they start following him. What do they say to Jesus? What's their response to him? They call out, they say, "Have mercy." And what do they call Jesus? The Son of David. So their response is to call out for help, and then they call him by this title, the Son of David. Now, have you heard that title before? Maybe you have, just in general, but you haven't heard it in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the first time that any of the characters in any of the stories call Jesus by this name, Son of David. What does that mean? They're Jewish, and they've grown up on the Jewish scriptures and hearing them in synagogue, and so they know all about the promise that God made to David. And maybe some of you do too. It's the promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it's a promise that God made that from David's line would come a future king who would lead the people of Israel to justice and mercy and would set up God's kingdom over the nations of the world and bring peace and so on. He's called the Messiah as the developing portrait of this figure goes on in the story of the Bible. And so this is the promised messianic king. That's what this title means. The king who comes from the line of David to make everything right. And so these blind men recognize Jesus as the Son of David. They're the first people in the story to call Jesus by that title. But it's not the first time that you've heard that title before. Put your thumb right here and just go back to the first sentence of the Gospel according to Matthew. Go back to page 1 of Matthew. And look at the first words of the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew begins his account. He says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the what? The Son of David." Do you see the connection there? So Matthew, he's telling you, right? Matthew is not like reading a spy novel or something, right? He just gives you the punchline in the very first words of the book. Here's what this book's about. It's about a man named Jesus of Nazareth, and here is Matthew's claim about him, and then everything in the story that follows is going to substantiate that claim. Here's Matthew's claim. Jesus is Israel's Messiah, which means that he is the Son of David who is promised by the prophets and the scriptures and so on. Now Matthew's made that claim, And now you as the reader, you have heard that claim about Jesus' identity. And it's interesting, then the story, it's not a spy novel where you're discovering things along with the characters. It's kind of like the one-way glass, right? That's what you are as you read the Gospel according to Matthew. It's like you're in this observation room and you're watching all the stories take place and you're like, oh, these idiots, like they don't get it, clearly. And then you're watching people in the story slowly come to recognize who Jesus is. And so go back to chapter 9 then with me. This is brilliant on Matthew's part, who are the first people to recognize the messianic identity of Jesus? Who are they in the story? Who are the first people to see Jesus for who he really is? Do you get it? That's brilliant. That's brilliant, isn't it? It's the blind who see before they actually see. It's the blind who see Jesus for who he really is before anybody else in the story. It's blind people who see Jesus. So I made a pun earlier that you all laughed at, right? They see Jesus coming, but in a sense, that's true. That's Matthew's point. And so what's going on here? There's something going on inside of them that enables them to have this insight. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that's the first response. It's the blind who see Jesus for who he really is. That's the first response. Look at the second response of people. It's the crowds. Go down after Jesus heals the man who can't talk and he's demon-possessed and so on, and he heals that man. And then look at verse 33. What's the response of the crowds? How do they respond to Jesus? What does Matthew say? He says they're amazed. And then their amazement is captured with their words. They say, nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel. And they're not just talking about the mute man speaking or the blind man seeing, although it is true. There is not any story in the Old Testament of someone whose eyes are non-functioning, right? They're born that way or whatever. Their eyes are broken and then they are transformed and able to see. There are stories about people becoming blind all of a sudden and then seeing again, but the idea of someone having broken eyes and then they're healed and transformed, this is the first time in Jewish history where something like this is happening. So what's their response? Their response, it's not that they see Jesus for who he really is, but what do they recognize? They recognize like there's no categories for Jesus. Never seen anything like this. Nothing like this has ever happened. There's this openness to Jesus. Jesus doesn't fit any categories that they have already. He is his own category. And the things that Jesus is doing is just remaking everything they've ever thought they knew or whatever. So you have the blind who see, and then you have the crowds who Jesus is redefining everything they thought they knew, and they have no categories for him, and their minds are blown. That's the second response. And then immediately Matthew gives you the third response here. The religious leaders, do you see? The Pharisees. And here's what they say. They say, it's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. Now that's an interesting response. So they're responding to the fact that Jesus just healed this man who was not able to talk and who was oppressed by demons, spiritual evil. So stop and just make sense of their response to Jesus. They watch Jesus. Can they deny that Jesus just did this thing in front of their eyes? Can they deny that? No, they can't deny that. Is Jesus powerful? Yes, right? Like that, Jesus is clearly powerful to do that for this man. But they immediately conclude that Jesus must be evil. Why do they conclude that? Because in contrast to these blind men who see Jesus for who he really is, and in contrast even to the crowds, who they recognize they've never seen anything like this, but they're open, clearly. They're stunned, and they're allowing Jesus to remake their ideas about everything. But these Bible teachers, that's what Pharisees are, they're local Bible teachers, and they are coming from a place that they have already concluded who Jesus is. Do you see that? They recognize who Jesus really is, the blind. The crowds are open to who Jesus is. These guys have also concluded who Jesus is, and it's not good. And so they've already made up their minds about who the God of Israel is. They're Bible teachers, right? They are leading the people of Israel in knowing and following the God of Israel. And so they see Jesus, and this is not the first time that they've been in conflict or they're suspicious of Jesus. We've seen that in these stories already. And so they believe they know the God of Israel already, and that Jesus is not only not on the God of Israel's side, but now they're coming to conclude that he is against the God of Israel. He's a false teacher. He's leading the people astray, and so on. And so they have this mindset already. They have already made up their minds about who Jesus is and who he's not. And so they observe the same exact events. Like, just think about this. You have the same event happening in front of all these people. And for some, these events lead them to see who Jesus is, the Messiah, the Son of David. For some, these events are blowing their minds and challenging everything. And those same exact events make this group of people even more closed-minded than they already were in the first place. It's the same event, but three very different responses here. You could say it this way. You could say you have the open minds of the blind. They're open to Jesus. You have the blown minds, right, of the crowd, and they're just like, holy cow, what is this? And then you have the closed mind of the Bible teachers, because they think they already know everything they need to know about the God of Israel, and Jesus doesn't fit into any of the boxes that they have, and so they box him out. They conclude that he must be evil. Do you see that here? Three very different responses. And Matthew has chosen to close this account, as we're going to see, a whole collection of stories about Jesus' power and healings and so on, with this story of these three responses.
These three responses. Okay. I know we tend to, on autopilot, right, respond that we are either the ones that are healed or the crowd, but we never be the religious leader, the Pharisee, the P word, right? But I think maybe, just maybe, we might want to sit back and ponder that. Uh, I I like that Tim has taken the time um, to give a framework to this account, right? By Matthew, uh, the life of the Messiah, and then the direction he intends on taking us, right? We, for the most part, uh, I would suspect, anyways, view all of the gospel accounts to be a collection of stories from a certain individual: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? Um, Yet we really have not considered, again, for the most part, that each of these authors have an agenda. Uh, I, I know we, especially in today's context, probably view that as a negative thing, the agenda, right? Um, I think I think I'd like us to rethink that. These men had a purpose, how they wanted to share the life and the times of the Messiah as it affected them. Remember, this is a look back story. It's not a live report on the ground kind of thing. These are stories looking back with purpose to share a story the way they wanted to tell it. Does that bother you? That these men had an agenda? Something that they wanted to share? That this is not a dictated by the Holy Spirit book? So maybe we need to take a step back, not come in with any preconceived ideas about how things are supposed to be. Can you hear the P word creeping in? But to stop, look, and listen. So Tim helps us understand where we are in this story that Matthew's trying to share, anyways. Um, and he makes a point that we're wrapping up this section of his agenda, and that we'll be making a shift in the story. And I'm looking forward to that. Um, and so we're wrapping it up with the healing of these two blind men and the mute. So in these wrapping up the stories of Jesus, um, this, like you heard earlier, this is where we got the context of the stained glass analogy that my ADHD self ran away with last week, right? The point that Tim brings out in his thoughts, though, is different. Each of these encounters brings out a new angle, a new facet of Jesus, another part of this stained glass designed to show Jesus' story. Okay. These people in these patterns of stories come to Jesus, like he said, with some sort of crisis. These are very real issues in their personal lives or the lives of those that love them, right? See the healing of the paralytic, right? For those folks that love their friend so much, okay? But Jesus does or says something that's awesome. And as Tim said, they walk away transformed. Our plot line in the story that Matthew was telling will take a shift after these two encounters. So I think this is worth peeking into. And remember, three responses, three different reactions to these encounters with Yeshua, the Messiah. Those healed or affected, those who watched the crowd, and those religious leadership folks. Some of them corrupt leadership, in particular, right? The scribes and the Pharisees. So these three groups, three different responses. But before we get to look ahead, I'd like to take a little step back and bring in another facet of the stained glass mosaic of Jesus, right? And it begins only 18 verses previous. Tim is sharing the preaching and teaching duties with Josh White at Door Hope at this time when these were recorded, right? And he has the other stories in between these teachings that we have with Tim. In fact, there's a link in the description below, right, that will take you to all of the Matthew teachings by both teachers. Josh had these stories that we're going to talk about, and I want to bring those up because we haven't covered them. But I just think we need to take a peek at these before we move forward, okay? So first one is Matthew, and Matthew's called. One of my points on that, or I covered a few weeks back with that clip from The Chosen, was that was impactful for me because I was asked the same question, so it hit me. So after Matthew, we get a question from some of the followers of John the Baptizer, right? You might think that since John was the herald of the Messiah, that maybe he would in some way get some kind of Holy Spirit download, a la the Matrix, and then just pass it on to his followers. Yet here, they're asking Jesus a question that probably could have been on some folks' minds, right? It, if anyone should have gotten the part of the Messiah, you would think that these guys, John's followers, would have at least gotten a head start. That these guys would have been part of that group. Okay. It's interesting. And this won't be the last time that we meet these followers of John. We're going to see him a couple of times. In this context, they're asking a fasting question. So let's keep a context thought. Fasting is not a commandment or an instruction thing. It's not a direct instruction at all. It is very much a part of life and a regular practice for a few ways of this is how we live out this part of our faith. And Jesus is very aware of it here. He doesn't tell them it's wrong. Quite the contrary. Jesus does bring in a context thought. He does not address why they're fasting directly, but he says that there will be a time for that, but not now for them. So I want to introduce a thought. This is a teaser. There is a time that this fasting can be happening in with some traditions, right? Remember, that's not bad. We still fast for many things and reasons, biblically and not, right? But this might be one of those days, what we now call Rosh Hashanah. Okay. Um, there is traditionally a time for fasting here. Now, we'll actually explore this time on the Dusty Feet next week. Okay. Because I want us to see what I think is a very real connection between this interaction with the followers of John and the response of what Jesus says. This is again about who he is, another facet. We're going to get into kingship. Okay. But that's for next week. Okay. That's for next week. This facet of Jesus, this one that he brings up here, this is the bridegroom with his bride. This is what he talks about here, right? They are together for now. So don't mourn or fast. That time will eventually get there. And he moves on. Then the next few verses are literally about stretching one's mind, right? Being open to stretching your thoughts. The new patch in the old garment. New wine in old wineskins. Maybe we should tackle those thoughts, but we'll have to leave that for another time as well. We will. So remember on this fasting thought that they're on the side of the Pharisees. Whatever time that they're in, whatever it is, the tradition has us fasting. So there's more testing and stretching of leadership thoughts, maybe. We'll get there with that. So then we have the girl restored to life and a woman healed. I love how we seem to be having these repeated patterns of characters, right? That they seem to be acting in different ways and not all at the same time. And we could be any one of them at any varied time in these varied stories. It's interesting, again, maybe that we have similar types of people: the healed, the crowd, and the religious leader. Yet we have a very different way that these three interact. So, the official from the synagogue, the local religious leader, he is the one that comes to Jesus with the issue or concern, right? His role in here is far from accusatory. It's in fact the opposite. He comes to Jesus with reverence, even bowing down to show his respect. This is not a bad thing at all. Jesus is seated, and he's answering some questions that we just talked about from his followers of John the Baptizer, right? He interrupts to beg Jesus to come and lay hands on his dead daughter so that she may live. In Matthew's storytelling context, how he is telling the story and putting the stories in the order that he wants to share, no one has yet been raised from the dead. Yet. So we're continuing to build on that authority character of Yeshua, but now we have power over the dead. That's a pretty big claim. So Jesus gets up, shows up at the house, tells the mourners and the ceremony folks, they're the ones with the flutes, right, to leave. He did not say that what they're doing was wrong, but merely that the girl was not dead, but sleeping. Probably another subtle point, maybe lost on us sometimes, about death. Um, but that discussion again will be for another time. But he raises her, and the crowd spreads the news throughout the land. On the way there, there's a woman was an issue of blood. Now, remember a few weeks ago, we talked about things that kept people separated, not only from community, but even the acts of service to God, right? That that was denied them due to a state of being. It was not a sin issue in any way, but it was a cleanliness, a prepared state, and safe for the community that kept them away from the temple, from that part of connecting with God. So she is hearing these stories about Jesus, this man who claims that he acts with the authority and power of God. He's forgiving sins and he's healing folks around the region. So she says to herself, I hear that. She might have even seen something. We don't know. But she thinks, and I believe that if I can get close enough to him to touch his garment, touch his tzitzit, okay? It saddens me a little bit that we continue to see these kinds of translations in our scriptures that strips the Hebrew context from the story, uh, since it would be uh, extremely evident what the tassels would be in the Jewish context, indeed. Okay. She thought, if I can just do that, I'd be healed. So she puts her plan into action. She squeezes in, she makes a grab for it. In Matthew's account, we get no reference to power leaving Jesus, right? We don't. That's in the Mark and Luke accounts. They're accounting the stories, and a number of them have much more detail. Matthew, like he's done a few times in his version of the stories, he keeps it concise. Just the part he wants to share. So in Matthew's version, it seems like Jesus just feels the tug, turns, and he speaks directly to the woman. Take courage. Be strengthened. Your faith has made you well. So we have another character trait of Jesus, authority of God, empowered by him, and so much so that is the action of faith that can help it be so just in you. There is no magic in the tzitzit. Yeshua's tzitzit held no special power. It was the faith of the woman and her action that brings that connection. Okay, so now we're where Tim has us in the story. And so now we're continuing to build up. We've caught up to where we're at. And we're continuing this, building this character and authority of Jesus, this possible to the people, maybe Messiah. And the response from the woman with blood issue and the blind men starts to take us over another hump. That tipping point, that faith action. We've seen that, but it's ramping up. But the blind men, they take it even further because they reference something that no one up to this point has really brought to the surface. Not John's followers, right? Not the disciples up to this point. It could have been murmured amongst some, but these two men in that Matthew story, they're the ones that pointed out. They've vocalized the thought, Son of David. I love, I really find interesting these full contexts and the events that surround this buildup of Matthew and the character and authority of Jesus and the demonstration of that with, like he said, the power to perform miracles that had not been seen in all the land. But in the last story, we take a 180-degree turn from the religious leader we had in the previous story, right? We went from one, yes, he was a local religious leader. He was not one of the Pharisaic leadership people from Jerusalem, because he saw Jesus as something more. He acted that out and showed the crowd his personal reverence to this teacher, this man of God. But now we have those leaders from Jerusalem, and they see the exact same thing that the people see. They've heard it. They witnessed the reaction of those healed too, the impact, the surrounding crowd, their response, knowing that they saw him as something more. And I think the crowd are still wrestling exactly with who he is, but they're growing in appreciation. But the blind men, as Tim pundit, it's the blind who see that he's the son of David. Yes, like Tim said, Matthew does mention it in the beginning of the scroll. But remember, this is a backward story. He's looking back, and he's telling the story forward the way he wants to share it. It was not like the disciples were making this claim at this time, right? He didn't even mention that. It's these two random blind men who work their way to get in a position to confront Jesus. They probably would have had to make a pretty good scene crying out to get him to turn aside, because there might be a good chance that there's a lot going on around Jesus, right? But Jesus listens, as he tends to do, and he continues the point to be made about the faith of those who come to him in need. These are the outcasts of mainstream community. These are certainly shunned by the religious elite. And he listens to their hearts, their pleas. Faith with action has been a common thread in a number of these stories. But these men, the Pharisee leadership, see the exact same thing, and like he said, comes to a very different conclusion. The last healing in this section, the mute, the crowd's amazed. But the P words see it again with a whole different twist, that he's that the adversary tosses out his own. Okay, that's wrong and backwards. I want to ignore that a point. I want to stretch our thoughts a bit about some other things. Is it possible? I tend to think it is, that some, not all by any means, right? But some of these healings attributed to spirits, they're all still very much healing, but also possible misunderstandings of the people and attributed to something it's not. Having certain ailments, epilepsy, certain mental conditions, even being blind and mute. These were considered forms of evil spirits for millennium, okay, all over. It really wasn't until fairly recently that we're really able to recognize and learn that so much can go on inside the human mind and what it can do to the body. Many with those ailments were shunned from society, locked away. Even in our lifetime, we still use shock treatments to fix them. Okay. They were left on the fringes of society. Even if they lived, it was substandard. Jesus was not there to correct their science, how they viewed ailments. He healed those folks from whatever was ailing them. And he got them back being able to connect fully with community and with God. In our relatively recent past, past 100 years or so, we have the remarkable story of Helen Keller. In her day, blind, deaf, mute could have been labeled with so many things. In her youth, she was very demonstrative, right? In Jesus' day, who knows how they would have tagged her. But God didn't heal her in her time. He instead brought Anne Sullivan into her life. And through that influence, we have the story we know today of Helen Keller, right? At 19 months old, Keller contracted an unknown illness described by doctors as an acute congestion of the stomach and the brain. Contemporary doctors believe it was probably meningitis or possibly influenza. But that illness left her both deaf and blind. Hence, at that age, 19, she's going to be mute. She lived, as she recalled in her autobiography, at sea in a dense fog. It was not until Anne Sullivan came into her life that she would be able to get out of that fog and into community. Anne Sullivan helped bring her there. She had done something that no one else had done before. And she cared enough for this little broken girl to bring her somewhere she had never ever been. So I want to leave you with this point to ponder. Are we willing to be open to God and be an Anne Sullivan? Can we help another understand and be part of community? So I want to leave you with a little video with Helen Keller.
A part of their so-called act was later filmed. It is the only existing record of Annie Sullivan's voice.
When I saw Helen Keller first, she was 6 years and 8 months old. She had been blind and deaf and mute since her 19th month as the result of an illness. She had no way of communicating with those around her except a few imitative signs that she had made for herself. A push meant go and a pull meant come and so on. She had observed that we did not use the hands when we were talking to each other. And I let her see, by putting her hand on my face, how we talked with our mouths. She felt the vibration of the spoken word. Instantly, she spelled, "I want to talk with my mouth." That seemed impossible. But after experimenting for a time, we found that placing her hand in this position, the thumb resting on the throat, right at the larynx, the first finger on the lips, the second on the nose, we found that she could feel the vibration of spoken words. For instance, the throat, she feels the G, the hard G, the. And on the lips, she feels and the K sound. On the lips, she feels the B, with the second finger on the nose, the nasal sounds, the 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 first word she learned to articulate was the little word it. With the hand in this position, I made the vowel I. She felt it. I. Then I made the T. She feels it with the finger on her lips, on my lips. Then I put the two letters together to form the word it, and the first word was learned. After her seventh lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word, I am not dumb now.
No. I am not dumb now. The amount of lives that have been directly and indirectly affected by this special interaction with these two God-created people, that they could do things maybe greater than Jesus did. Those are his words, not mine. I might even go so far as to say that love for that little broken girl was the catalyst for the source of the miracle. I think we miss so much because we are blind and maybe even deaf to so many things, and our predispositions to a concept like miracles, that they're always instantaneous, that they have to happen right now. But I tend to think upside down, and not are all that way. Maybe just like nature, things become over time, yet with miraculous effect. Maybe we even think that if someone is not instantaneously, miraculously healed, that they have a defect or a fault. Maybe it's a lack of faith, so that they maybe did something wrong to deserve it. What happened to them was a consequence of sin. Oh, crud. There's that P word again, creeping in. As you can tell, I think differently. And I hope to be able to see more miracles than I've ever thought possible. Because I am open-minded. I have an open-minded faith. Maybe enough to look and see things, maybe that only the blind can see. Thanks for being with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.